There is a particular kind of hunger that has nothing to do with food. It lives somewhere behind the eyes. It makes grown men forget their names, their vows, their children waiting at home. And in a small city in the American South, there was a woman whose cooking fed that hunger so completely, so devastatingly, that people who ate at her restaurant described it the way you'd describe falling in love for the first time. Warm, overwhelming, impossible to walk away from. Her name was Dorothy Graves. And for 6 years, she built an empire out of that feeling. But on a Tuesday afternoon in June, at exactly 1:47 in the afternoon, a clay pot slipped from a worker's hands, shattered across the kitchen floor, and what spilled out of it didn't just end her restaurant. It ended marriages. It ended reputations. And within 3 weeks, it ended her. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. How does a woman with no formal culinary training, no restaurant experience, and no financial backing open a small southern kitchen and within 18 months have a 2-hour waiting list every single day of the week? How does she charge prices that would make a fine dining chef blush and still turn people away at the door? And how do otherwise rational men with families, careers, reputations, find themselves rearranging their entire lives just to sit at one of her tables? These are the questions that the people of Grover County, North Carolina, started asking quietly among themselves long before the truth came out. They didn't have answers. They just knew that something about Dorothy Graves and her restaurant felt different from anything they'd experienced before. And they were right. Just not in the way they imagined. Dorothy Graves grew up in Grover County, the kind of small southern city where the same families had owned the same businesses for 3 generations and newcomers were regarded with polite but persistent suspicion. She was the second of 4 children. Her mother, a quiet and deeply religious woman named Ruth, worked double shifts at a textile plant for most of Dorothy's childhood. Her father left when Dorothy was 11 and was rarely spoken of after that. By all accounts, Dorothy was a sharp, observant child, the kind who watched adults more than she played with other kids, who remembered everything she heard and stored it away like currency. She was not, by any measure, a particularly gifted cook growing up. Her older sister handled most of the cooking in their household. Dorothy's role was to watch and to learn and to wait for her moment. She left Grover County at 18 for a community college in Charlotte, came back at 23 with an associate's degree in business administration and a hunger that had nothing to do with food. She wanted success. Not the quiet, modest kind, the visible kind. The kind that makes people who once looked past you start paying very close attention. She worked for 3 years as an office manager at a catering company owned by a woman named Mrs. Clara Hutchins, who was beloved in the region and had built her business on 30 years of hard work and an extraordinary gift for Southern cooking. Clara took Dorothy under her wing completely. She taught her recipes that had been in her family for generations. She introduced her to suppliers, to event planners, to the network of relationships that made her business run. She told people, Dorothy is going to be something special one day. She meant it as a compliment. She had no idea how right she was or what it would cost her. In the spring of Dorothy's 3rd year working for Clara, something shifted. Customers who had been loyal to Clara's catering for years began quietly redirecting their business. Event planners stopped returning her calls. Her signature dishes, the ones she had spent decades perfecting, suddenly seemed to lose their appeal, even to people who had eaten them happily for years. Clara couldn't explain it. She hired a consultant. She updated her menu. She lowered her prices. Nothing worked. Within 14 months of Dorothy's departure, Clara Hutchins had lost 60% of her clientele. Her marriage had quietly come apart, and she had moved in with her daughter 2 towns over. Struggling with what her family described as a deep and prolonged depression. She never reopened her business. And Dorothy Graves, meanwhile, had opened a restaurant of her own. The restaurant was called Graves' Kitchen. It occupied a modest storefront on Clement Street, in a part of town that had seen better days. The space was not glamorous. There were 12 tables, mismatched chairs, and ceiling fans that wobbled slightly when they ran on the highest setting. But from the very first week, something about it drew people in a way that defied easy explanation. Dorothy's signature dish was a slow-cooked short rib over stone-ground grits, finished with what she described as a family herb blend. People who ate it said things that sounded less like food reviews and more like confessions. "I've never tasted anything like it. I drove 40 minutes out of my way just to come back. I don't even eat red meat, and I ordered it 3 times." The waiting list appeared within 6 weeks of opening. By the end of the first year, Dorothy was turning away more customers than she was seating. She raised her prices twice. The line got longer both times. The money was real, and it was significant. Dorothy moved from a rented apartment to a 4-bedroom house on the north side of town within 18 months of opening. She drove a car that made people look twice at stoplights. She wore things that didn't come from any store in Grover County. And she did it all with a composure that some people found admirable and others found quietly unsettling. She was never loud about it. She didn't throw parties or make speeches. She simply moved through her success the way a person moves through a room they've always known, as if it had been waiting for her, and she had simply arrived to claim it. "Money loves me," she told a local reporter who came to profile her in the restaurant's second year. "I figured out a long time ago that the feeling is mutual." The reporter laughed. The quote ran as the headline. People shared it. Dorothy framed it and hung it on the wall behind the register. But not everyone was charmed. Every morning, without fail, an older woman appeared outside the restaurant before opening. She sat on an overturned milk crate on the sidewalk, and she said the same thing, in the same flat voice, to anyone who would listen: "The pot will overflow." Most people walked past her. Some dropped her $1 or a granola bar. A few recognized her as Clara Hutchins, Clara, who had once been one of the most respected caterers in the county, now sitting barefoot on a sidewalk outside the restaurant of the woman she'd once called her protégée. Dorothy saw her every morning through the front window. She never had her removed. That fact struck people as strange later, when they had reason to think back on it. Because Dorothy was not, by nature, a patient or sentimental woman. The only explanation anyone could come up with was that Clara's presence served some purpose Dorothy didn't want to give up. What that purpose was, nobody could say for certain. Ask yourself this. Have you ever watched someone you love become obsessed with something you couldn't understand? Not drugs. Not another person. Just a place, a habit, a pull toward something that seemed ordinary from the outside, but was clearly consuming them from the inside. because that's what the families in Grover County were living with. And most of them didn't have words for it yet. Thomas Adwell had been married to his wife, Sandra, for 22 years. They had 3 kids. He coached his son's soccer team on weekends and taught Sunday school twice a month. By every visible measure, he was a man who had his life together. Sandra noticed the change in August of the restaurant's 2nd year. He started coming home from lunch later. Then he started skipping lunch at home entirely. "I grabbed something on Clement Street," he'd say. She didn't think much of it at first. Then she noticed he'd stopped eating her cooking. Not in a dramatic, confrontational way, just quietly. He'd sit at the dinner table, pick at his plate, and claim he wasn't very hungry. He'd been hungry enough at 1 o'clock in the afternoon to eat at Graves' kitchen. She found the receipts in his jacket pocket one evening while doing laundry. Not one receipt. A stack of them. Dates spanning 4 months. Sometimes 2 visits in a single day. She sat on the bedroom floor with those receipts in her hands and tried to understand what she was looking at. She thought he was having an affair. She hired someone to follow him. What they found was not another woman. It was just a restaurant. Thomas Adwell, a perfectly rational man, was spending money they didn't have to eat at a restaurant twice a day, every day, with the kind of devotion most people reserve for religion. Thomas was not alone. A dentist named Dr. Marcus Webb rescheduled patient appointments to make it to Graves' kitchen before the kitchen closed. A pastor at one of the larger Baptist congregations in the county, who preached regularly about the dangers of earthly indulgence, was in Dorothy's line every Friday without fail. A city councilman put the restaurant on his expense account 11 times in a single quarter. These were not reckless men. They were not impulsive men. They were men who, by every other measure of their lives, made careful, considered decisions. And yet something about this restaurant had gotten into them in a way they couldn't account for and didn't try very hard to explain. "It's just the food," Thomas told Sandra when she finally confronted him. "You wouldn't understand." That sentence, "you wouldn't understand," became one Sandra would carry for years. And then there were the workers. Dorothy employed 6 people in the kitchen and 4 in the front of house. Most of them were grateful for the job, at least at first. But a young woman named Keisha, who worked the prep station, started showing up to shifts looking hollowed out. Dark circles. Trembling hands. She told her roommate she was having dreams she couldn't describe when she woke up, not nightmares exactly, more like a feeling of weight, of pressure, of something pressing down on her chest while she slept. She lost 12 pounds in 2 months without trying. Her mother drove up from Fayetteville and cried when she saw her. Keisha quit in March. She moved back home. For months later, she was hospitalized for what doctors called an unexplained cardiac event. She was 24 years old. She survived, but just barely. And when people in the county started connecting dots, her name was one of the first ones that came up. Let's pause here for a second, because this is the part of the story where most people start to feel something shift in their chest. If you were Sandra, sitting on that floor with a stack of restaurant receipts, what would you have done? If you were Keisha's mother, watching your daughter disappear before your eyes over a kitchen job, would you have pushed harder for answers? Tell us in the comments. We read every single one. Because the next part of this story is where everything changes. 6 years before the restaurant opened, Dorothy Graves had been a different kind of desperate. She was 29, recently passed over for a promotion at Clara's catering company, and living in a one-bedroom apartment with a broken radiator and a checking account that hovered near zero every 2 weeks. She had watched other people succeed her entire life, had watched carefully, had taken notes, had done everything she believed you were supposed to do, and still she was here. Invisible. Overlooked. Tired. She started spending time with a woman named Miss Vera, who lived out on Route 9 in a house that sat back far from the road and wasn't visible from the street. Miss Vera was known in certain circles, not widely, not publicly, but known. People went to her when they'd run out of other options. Dorothy went to her in February, during a sleet storm, with $60 in her pocket and nothing left to lose. What happened in that house on Route 9 is something Dorothy never spoke about directly. But the arrangement she came out with was specific, and it had conditions. The success would be real. The money would be real. But there was something that had to go into the pot, a preparation, a mixture that Miss Vera gave her in a sealed clay container, and it could never be seen. It could never be exposed. If eyes fall on what's in this pot, Miss Vera told her, everything it built will fall with it. Dorothy accepted those terms. She told herself she'd stop when she had enough. She never did. Because that's the nature of that kind of arrangement. There is never enough. The hunger that drives a person to a house on Route 9 during a sleet storm doesn't go away when the money comes. It just changes its shape. Dorothy fed it for 6 years. And she was still feeding it on the morning of June 15th, when she overslept for the first time in all those years, rushed her preparation, and left the clay container, the one that was never, under any circumstances, supposed to be near the serving area, sitting too close to the edge of the prep station. The lunch rush that Tuesday was the heaviest of the season. Every table was full. The waiting area by the door had people standing 3 deep. The kitchen was moving at a pace that left no room for error. At 1:47 in the afternoon, a worker named Jerome reached across the prep station for a serving ladle. His elbow caught the edge of the clay container. It tipped. It fell. The sound it made when it hit the tile floor was not loud, a dull, dense crack, like something ancient breaking, and for just a moment, the kitchen went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with noise. Then someone looked at what had spilled. Then someone else looked. And then the first scream came from the back of the kitchen, and it moved through the restaurant like a current. What was on that floor, mixed in with the herbs and the oil and the dark liquid that had splashed across the tile, were things that had no business being in any kitchen. A bundle of hair, tied with thread. A small cloth pouch containing what appeared to be soil and ash. Several small bones that were later identified by the county medical examiner as animal in origin, but that identification came later, after the panic, after the phones came out. After the photographs were already spreading across every group chat and Facebook page in the county. In the moment, nobody was waiting for a medical examiner. In the moment, people were pushing back from tables, grabbing children, abandoning half-eaten plates, rushing for the door. 3 people were sick in the parking lot. A man who had eaten there nearly every day for 2 years sat in his car with his hands on the steering wheel and did not move for 40 minutes. Dorothy stood in the middle of it all and did not run. She did not explain. She stood very still, and people who were there that afternoon described what they saw on her face not as guilt or fear, but as something closer to resignation, the expression of a person who has been outrunning something for a long time and has finally felt it catch up. And outside, on the sidewalk, Clara Hutchins stood up from her milk crate, and for the first time in months, she wasn't saying anything. She was just watching. And she was crying not with grief, but with something that looked, from a distance, almost like relief. The Grover County Sheriff's Department arrived within the hour. The restaurant was taped off. Dorothy was taken in for questioning. The county health department followed. Investigators found additional containers in a locked cabinet in her office, more of the same preparation, sealed in the same clay jars. They found records that didn't match the reported ingredient lists. They found evidence of financial dealings with Miss Vera, whose house on Route 9 was visited the following morning and found empty, the woman herself nowhere to be located, the house appearing to have been unoccupied for some time, though neighbors said they had seen lights on as recently as the night before. Dorothy's assets were frozen pending investigation. Her house, her car, her bank accounts, all of it suspended while the legal process began its slow, grinding work. The men who had been regulars at Graves' kitchen went through something in the weeks that followed that none of them had adequate language for. The pull they had felt, that irrational, consuming need to go back, again and again, lifted almost immediately after the restaurant closed. Thomas Adwell described it to his wife as waking up from a dream you didn't know you were having. "I can't explain it," he told her. "I just know that something had me, and now it doesn't." Sandra sat across from him at their kitchen table and didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, "I want you to go to counseling." He said yes. The pastor issued a public statement that was notable mostly for what it didn't say. There was no explanation, no theological framework offered, just an acknowledgement that he had exercised poor judgment and a request for privacy. The dentist quietly relocated his practice to another county. The councilman did not seek re-election. 3 weeks after the restaurant closed, Dorothy Graves died in the county detention facility. She had been in good health at the time of her admission. No illness was identified. No cause was found. The medical examiner's report listed the cause of death as cardiac arrest, undetermined etiology, which is the clinical way of saying they didn't know why her heart stopped. She was 41 years old. A nurse who was present at the end said Dorothy had been lucid until nearly the last moment. Her final words, spoken quietly to no one in particular, were, "I thought I could stop whenever I wanted." That sentence will sit differently with different people, but it sits. Clara Hutchins, in the months after Dorothy's death, slowly began to recover. She moved back to Grover County the following spring. She didn't reopen her catering business. That chapter, she said, was finished. But she began cooking again for herself, for her daughter's family, for neighbors who knocked on her door. She stopped sitting outside on the sidewalk. She started sleeping through the night again. People who had known her before said she seemed lighter somehow, as though something that had been fastened to her had finally been cut loose. She never spoke publicly about what she knew or when she had known it. She simply came back, quietly, to the life that had been taken from her, smaller than it had been before, but real and hers. The storefront on Clement Street sat empty for nearly 2 years. A hardware store opened there eventually. The new owners repainted the walls, retiled the floor, replaced everything that could be replaced. But for a long time after it reopened, Certain customers said that in the late afternoon, when the light came through the front window at a particular angle, they could catch just the faintest trace of something in the air, not unpleasant exactly, but distinctive, familiar in a way they couldn't place. Most of them didn't linger long enough to think about it very hard, which was almost certainly the right instinct. So here is the question this story leaves us with, and it is not a comfortable one. How often do we consume things, experiences, relationships, ambitions, habits, without ever asking what they cost to produce? Dorothy Graves built something extraordinary. The success was real. The money was real. The food was real. But underneath all of it was a transaction she had made in the dark, and the price of that transaction was paid not just by her, but by everyone around her who never agreed to pay anything at all. Thomas Udwell paid it. Sandra paid it. Clara paid it most of all. And Keisha, a 24-year-old woman just trying to hold down a job, nearly paid it with her life. If you knew, truly knew, what went into something before you consumed it, would it change what you chose? Would it change how you chose? Tell us in the comments. We genuinely want to know. And if this story reached something in you, if it made you think about the invisible costs of the things we want badly enough to make dangerous decisions for, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe for more stories that don't just entertain. They make you think. They make you feel. And sometimes, they make you ask better questions.